It is not likely that such a reform in the land system could be brought about fast enough to work any great hardship to present landowners. In the gradual change of conditions, men would easily adjust themselves to the new order. It might be found desirable to grant a measure of compensation in cases where palpable injustice would otherwise result, or it might be arranged that land would come under the new system only as it passed through the probate courts, or as it otherwise changed hands. In any event, the movement for land reform has reached a stage in the world's affairs where no present or prospective landowner of intelligence can plead that he has had no warning of the impending change. Any purchase of land now presupposes that the buyer is cognizant of the fact that he is putting his money into a title that has been called in question before the bars of human intelligence and eternal justice, with the chances in favor of its being declared null and void. The single tax would not affect the economic law of rent. It would merely appropriate rent to society. It would not matter then how few men held the land or to what height land values soared, as all would share alike in the benefits received. Vacant land would be taxed just as much as improved land of like value, so that no man could afford to hold land that he did not use. All idle land would therefore be put to use by the holders, or it would pass to other hands or back into the public domain. As we have said, the single tax is expected to come about by degrees through the gradual throwing of the entire burden of taxation onto land values. One of the tendencies from the start, however, would be the bringing of idle land into use and the consequent lowering of all land values by reason of its coming into competition with the land already in use, so that even if the scheme came into vogue all at once with the decrease in land values, the single tax, although still the entire rental value, would be, at the beginning at least, much less than the present rentals. The bringing of the idle land into use would vastly facilitate production of all kinds, so that the demand for labor would be unprecedented, and the increased earnings of workers of all classes would in turn make demand for more and more production, to the greatly augmented prosperity of all. There would be no more land speculation with its baneful results, and all private monopoly based on land monopoly, as nearly all monopolies are, would vanish. Agricultural lands with their low values compared with city lands would bear a much smaller share of taxation than at present, and many farms would pay no tax at all, for after all the land needed for various kinds of production has been appropriated, there would still remain in every part of the world vast tracts of good land unused, and no farmer would have to pay a tax except in the degree that his land was more valuable than the unused land. Land values would go down from their present plane, but the demand for land products would go up, and the farmer would get his returns not from the value of his land, but from the value of his labor as represented by his products. There would always be free land comparatively easy of access, so that no man willing to work need ever be out of employment, since as a last resort he could always be his own employer on the land. This is not a brief for the single tax propaganda. Perhaps all single tax advocates would not agree that all of these things would result, but these are some of the conditions to be sought for in a righteous land system, a system that will stand the test of honesty between man and man, and through the single tax or by some other method they are sure to come. Land and labor. All men have equal rights in the bounties of nature. All men have equal rights to land. This is the final principle of honesty, but it is the first in order of fundamental importance, since, as has already been stated, it is only the application of this principle to the affairs of life that can make possible the realization of the blessings of the first two, that every man has a right to what he produces, and of all the products of human labor, no man has a right to what he does not produce. When this final principle is put into effect, the others will be found working themselves out precisely and automatically in every realm of industry. It will be easy to determine, or rather it will determine itself, what part of the joint product of capital and labor belongs in honesty to capital and what part to labor, what part of the total output of the factory belongs by right to the employer, what part to the overseer, what part to the employees, and even what part to each individual employee. what part of the product of a machine should go in equity to its inventor, what part to its maker, what part to its owner, and what part to its operator. All this seemingly hopeless maze of complexity resolves itself into order and simplicity when once all men are granted free access to land. And this great boon to labor will be in addition to the advantage already cited in the greater demand for labor through the vastly increased production that will follow the forcing of idle land into use. We saw how, in the exchange of values, it is easy, under free competition, for the two parties to a bargain, neither of whom is coerced in the matter, to determine the equivalent of values, not by any absolute artificial standard, but by the absolutely satisfactory natural standard of mutual agreement. And exactly the same principle and the same standard would hold good throughout the industrial world if men were free. The relations of capital to labor, of employer to employee, and in large degree of fellow employees to each other, are in analysis only those of buyer and seller in the exchange of values. And when both sides of the bargain are acting in a free market and without coercion, the exchange must of necessity be of economic equivalence and to the satisfaction of all concerned, and there can be no more exacting standard of honesty and justice than this. But this standard is utterly impossible of application under the present land system. The great masses of working men, shut off from access to the earth through land monopoly, participated in and fostered by the very class from whom they must seek employment, are under constant and dire coercion. They are not free men, and they cannot treat as free men with those to whom they must sell their labor. Denied the natural means of livelihood, they rest under the perpetual necessity of acceding to the demands of capital as the condition of their continued existence. They know that they must work today at the capitalist's price or starve tomorrow. Like the defenders of a beleaguered city, overpowered and surrounded by the enemy and cut off from all supplies from without, their only alternative is to capitulate on any terms offered or to die. Futility of labor unions. The labor unions seek to counteract this awful advantage of the capitalist over the working man by organizing to meet coercion with coercion, and through a kind of perpetual war they succeed in a degree in bettering the condition of their own members, and in some measure, though incidentally, in benefiting other laborers outside of their membership. But their warfare as a general thing is as bitter against other working men as against the capitalists, and the gains they make for themselves are of necessity artificial and arbitrary. If the entire body of the working men could be included in the unions, and if their combined resources were equal to those of the capitalists, there might be hope for a just solution of the labor problem by the labor union method. But with the capitalists and their allies entrenched in the undisputed possession of the earth, the source of all supply for the sustenance of both sides of the controversy, there could be but one result to such a contest. Unless the unions could wrest the land from their opponents, they would fight in vain, and unless their present movement has as its eventual achievement the control of land, unionism is and can be only a temporary expedient for the amelioration of the condition of the laboring classes. But there will be no need of a labor union war for the possession of the earth. The trend of the times has set irrevocably toward the restoration of the land to humanity by peaceful measures and the inauguration of an era when all the just aims of the labor union movement will be realized without the necessity of further organization or coercion. With free access to the land, the entire labor world will be placed in a position to treat with capital on an entirely different basis. Every man will be free to sell his labor or not as he pleases. No man will need to accept the terms offered unless he thinks that the wage is a full equivalent for his services. He won't have to work for the capitalist today or starve tomorrow. He will be able at all times to take his choice between working for another and working for himself. Land, the great employer. Through long years of injustice, we have become accustomed to look upon laboring men as a class dependent upon their employers, and so they are, under the present unrighteous conditions. Somebody must give them work or they perish. We have come to regard it as the acme of prosperity for the working man when some kind capitalist provides him a place in the industrial world that permits him by dint of hard economy to keep soul and body together. And unspeakably grateful must he be when a benign providence or political buncombe assures him of a steady job and a full dinner pail. In this attitude toward working men, we ignore the fundamental fact of the industrial world. The earth itself is the natural employer of labor. The land has a job all the time for every son of humanity with an abundant living as his wage, and it is only an unrighteous land law that steps in and says he shall not work. It cannot be emphasized too strongly that the labor question of our day and generation is the land question, and that it can never be settled justly and honestly under the present land system. Yet it is easy to underestimate the importance of right land laws and their effect upon the industrial world. It may be said in truth that even with free access to the land, comparatively few men of the congested labor centers would accept the opportunity to take themselves back to the land and to agricultural pursuits. But those who give weight to that argument miss the vital point of the entire land and labor question. The very fact that the land was there, ready and waiting for his occupancy, whenever he might choose to improve the opportunity, would make every man free and independent. Labor would no longer be a suppliant at the feet of capital, but the two would meet on equal terms and negotiate to their mutual advantage. No man would have to accept the terms offered him by any would-be employer. Every man would be in a position to take his choice between the preferred wage on the one hand and the land on the other, and that would make it certain that the wages in no industry would fall below what the average man could produce for himself as his own employer upon the land. And more than that, since every man would be free, no man would join in any industrial enterprise that did not promise him what he believed to be the full product of his labor, nor would he continue in any enterprise in which he was not satisfied that he was getting his full share of the proceeds.